Hello and welcome to our latest lesson. We are in the book of First Kings, chapter 19. And if you were with us for the previous lesson, you will know that one ended with a bang because we had Elijah up against the prophets of Baal, and uh, he had God's help, of course, and he was extremely successful, and everything was looking great. Uh, of course, his goal was to turn the people back to God, and it appeared that everything was going along with that. Now, he did have a problem in that Ahab was only a little bit of an annoyance to him, but Ahab's wife, the queen Jezebel, absolutely hated God and the people of God, and she really didn't have any better of opinion of Elijah. And when she found out all of these prophets she had sponsored were dead, she sent a message to Elijah saying essentially, you're going to be dead by this time tomorrow. Well, this came as a big shock to Elijah because he apparently thought that after this great victory, Israel was going to turn back to God and that the problems the country had been having would be solved. And this greatly disturbed him. It scared him enough so that he ran away. Now, we don't know what God had in mind for Elijah during this time, but Elijah was listening only to himself and to his own fears. And he left the country of Israel, went through Judah as far away as he could go. He was headed south. And when he got to the edge of the desert, he left his servant behind, and then he went on, and finally he had to stop and rest. Now, for the distance that he had gone, it would have taken about a week to have made that. So if he's been going day after day, and especially if he'd been traveling extra distance each one of those days, then he's worn out by now, and he falls asleep. Well, an angel appears, wakes him up, and has bread and water for him, and he eats and drinks and goes back to sleep. And then later, the angel wakes him up again, and there's more bread and water for him. And some of us think of, well, bread and water, that's really not much. But you have to remember, bread was made differently from what we have now, and it was a lot better for you. It had a lot more in it that was good for you at that time. And so people could have just bread and water and be pretty healthy with that. Well, with this, he had much extra energy and he began a longer journey. This is one that took him, the Bible says 40 days and 40 nights. And so we've heard that uh, term used before, and it describes his journey going back to Mount Sinai. And that doesn't mean that he had been there before, but when we talk about going back to Mount Sinai, we remember how important that mountain was, and especially in reference to Moses receiving the Ten Commandments. So we still don't know what Elijah is doing, and he gets there, and in the evening he finds a cave, and he goes inside the cave, and there he is. Still, why is Elijah here? Well, that's the question God poses to him. He hears God's voice and says, Elijah, what are you doing? And Elijah starts talking about how he had gone to Israel and no one would turn back toward God, and they had killed the prophets, and they were now trying to kill him. And so God says nothing at this point, except to say, oh, step outside the cave. Now, we're not sure if Elijah goes out or not. The Bible doesn't say that he goes out, but he is aware of what happens. And what it is, to start with, there's a huge windstorm so powerful that rocks are shattered. Okay, that's a big deal. That will get your attention. That then is followed by an earthquake. Again, something that you cannot ignore. If you've ever been through an earthquake, it is scary. Next thing that comes along, fire raining down. And we have to be reminded at this point that, oh, yes, that's what God had done at Mount Carmel during the contest with the prophets of Baal. There's all of that. But God is in none of those things. He's not in the wind, He's not in the earthquake, and He's not in the fire. But then there's a quiet voice that speaks to Elijah, and that's where God is. And again, God says, okay, what are you doing? Elijah hasn't picked up on the lesson, or he doesn't want to acknowledge what God's trying to get him to see, that God can be in the very big things, like the contest, the fire coming down from heaven. But God can also just as easily be in a quiet voice that whispers and passes along something that the person needs to know. And it could be any person. Well, Elijah just goes back to his saying, well, I worked hard for the Lord and no one wanted to listen to me. And they also tried to wipe out the prophets, and I'm the only one left. Okay, well, we know that there had been some other prophets, the ones that Obadiah was hiding from Jezebel. There were about 100 of them. So we think that, okay, maybe Elijah means I'm the only one who's doing anything, because those others were in hiding. They weren't out working with the people. So you think, okay, maybe he's getting away with that. Well, God gives some very clear instructions at this point. He's no longer just trying to get Elijah to say what he should say. He now directs Elijah what to do. He says, okay, here's what you're going to do. You're going to head back in that direction, and I've got a couple of guys that I want you to anoint as king, one for Aram and one for Israel. And you start thinking, wait, Aram already has a king. Israel has a king as well. So what's going on? But then we remember, wait, back when Saul was king and not doing a good job of it, someone was sent, we're talking about Samuel, was sent to anoint David as the next king, even though Saul was still alive. So that's what we've got going on here. So he's told to go anoint these two people who are to be kings. Okay, but then he also says, go to Elisha, whose name is very similar to Elijah, but Elisha is a different person. He said, go to him and anoint him. He's going to be the one to take your place. Well, during a lot of this time, Elijah had been saying things like, oh, I wish I were dead, because, everybody's trying to kill me. Well, this is kind of like God saying that, okay, you're bringing in the guy to take your place because you're not going to live forever. In fact, it may be sooner than you think. So we don't know how Elijah took all of this. I want to think that he did go and anoint these two men, but later on we find out that Elisha goes back to the guy who's to be made the next king of Israel and anoints him. So who knows if Elijah followed it or not. What we would find is that in the long run, the king of Aram is going to eventually kill Ahab, the bad king of Israel. And the newer king of Israel is going to be the one who ends up killing Jezebel. So God's enemies are going to be dealt with in all of this. although Elijah might not be around to see it. But you see, Elijah doesn't know everything that's going on. He doesn't know God's plans. But he ends up leaving the cave and heading back north and finding Elisha, and brings along Elisha with him. So when we get to the end of the story, we find that it's just not as comfortable as we would like, because we think Elijah, and personally, I like Elijah and what he was able to accomplish. But we do see that when he got his focus off of God, then uh, problems increased for him. And what we want to remember from this too is one little thing I had not brought up yet. When God's telling him to do all of these things, it's almost like a, by the way, he adds to what he's saying to Elijah, saying, oh, there's 7,000 people in Israel who have not bowed to Baal, meaning they still followed God. So you're not the only one. And they stayed. So Elijah is given correction by God, but he's also allowed to go on working for God. So our big lesson in all of this is that there will be times when there will be great victories for us as we work for God, but there can also be setbacks. What we just have to realize is that God is still with us. The important thing is for us to be with God and trust Him in all that He has planned. Okay, with that, I'm going to let you go. Now, today's tie, I've got one of, in this case, it's called Rat Race. There are all these rats running. And I think of Elijah being the one in front, and he's running because he ran away in all of this. The thing is, he thinks he's the only one. But then there's 7,000 others following God who weren't running away, even though the tie shows that they are running. We're just thinking about this as it relates to Elisha. Okay, with that, I hope you'll think about this, and I hope you'll be back next time. Bye.